Welcome to Stingray Tom's Florida and a deeper dive into the archive. I'm using these deeper dives to look at aspects of Florida's tourism history that are better understood by exploring the books, brochures, and maps that are in the archive. Today I'll be covering an aspect of the somewhat organic nature of the development of Florida tourism by looking at aspects of the Silver Springs area east of Ocala. Silver Springs is the location of what is arguably the longest operating of Florida's attractions, with a history dating back to the 1850s. Before I get started, it's important to note that Silver Springs is a term which has several different meanings. It's the name of one particular attraction which has been in operation since the 19th century. It's the name of the powerful artesian springs that create and sustain the Silver River. It's the name of the unincorporated community that developed around it all, and it's the name of the recently created state park that encompasses the area of the original attraction and beyond. So join me in the Wayback Machine as I head to Florida tourism's infancy. Prior to the American Civil War, tourism in East Florida was confined to the port city of Jacksonville, the historic city of St. Augustine, and trips on steamboats along the St. Johns River. The St. Johns is Florida's longest and largest river. It flows from Indian River County north to Jacksonville, where it reaches the Atlantic. Along its 310-mile or 500-kilometer run, it mostly parallels Florida's coastline. In that distance, Florida's Great River only drops about 30 feet or 9 meters in elevation. Its only significant tributary is the Ocklawaha River, which joins it near the city of Palatka. In turn, the Silver River is one of the significant tributaries of the Ocklawaha. So the Silver River flows into the Ocklawaha and then on towards the St. Johns. It was through the use of steamboats, most notably that of Hubbard L. Hart's Hart Line, established in 1860, that the remote area was first reliably connected to the rest of the country. The steamboats brought settlers to the Ocala area. They also took away lumber. Obviously, this was right before the Civil War, so much of Hart's plans were inevitably postponed. His boats did operate during the war, moving lumber, beef, and other materials. After the war, Hart was cleared of all charges brought against him in conjunction with the company's support of the Confederacy. He continued his operation and soon added tourism to the list of items his steamboats handled. The 1860s and 70s would become the real start of tourism at Silver Springs. At the start of the Silver River, there is a small basin or pool that's been created by at least 30 springs flowing out of the Florida aquifer. This is Silver Springs, the largest artesian spring system in the world, with an average daily outflow of 528 million gallons, or, for some perspective, the equivalent of 800 Olympic swimming pools, every day. Its outflow is so large that in a little over 5 years, Silver Springs could fill Lake Okeechobee, the 8th largest lake in the United States. The origin of the attraction Silver Springs initially had its beginnings with the steamboats, but it was the development of glass bottom boats that allowed visitors to peer to the bottom of the pool which created the iconic attraction. The glass bottom boats are generally accepted to have been invented at the springs in 1878, so this is the year that's often used to mark Silver Springs' beginnings as the longest-running tourist attraction in Florida. Like at many Florida springs, swimming, fishing, and boating were popular at Silver Springs, but it was the ability to view into the pure water to see the fish and plants, as well as large bubbling masses of water pushing through fissures, which changed Silver Springs from a picnic spot into an honest-to-goodness attraction. I'll drop in to visit early Silver Springs in a future video, but at this point I'm jumping about 50 years into the future, into the late 1920s. In those intervening years, relatively little changed at Silver Springs, but in 1929, Silver Springs would move into its next phase. A local named Ross Allen, who was a self-educated expert on snakes and other reptiles, approached Silver Springs with an idea. The operators of Silver Springs, Walter Carl Ray Sr. and W.M. Shorty Davidson, agreed to let Allen create a reptile institute on their grounds, an attraction that was partly entertainment, partly education, and partly focused on scientific research. Allen was one of the first reptile experts in the world and brought his knowledge to Silver Springs. He would entertain tourists by milking the venomous snakes, all the while collecting the venom for the production of antivenom. His work, both with venom research as well as with reptiles in general, put Silver Springs on the map for scientific research. Among other things, the Reptile Institute's work proved invaluable in protecting the U.S. military in Southeast Asia during World War II. Allen would also team up with indigenous Seminoles to recreate a village where a community of Seminoles could live, make crafts to sell to tourists, and assist in the work of the Institute. Eventually, the Ross Allen Reptile Institute had both a reptile show and a general wildlife show. Allen himself would regularly work with venomous snakes, alligators, crocodiles, and snapping turtles to entertain and hopefully educate the visitors to Silver Springs. By 1936, Ray and Davidson had added a second boating experience to their operation, a jungle cruise that was separately operated by a Colonel Toohey. This was done in a faster boat that took visitors along the Silver River. The Jungle Cruise was a self-described 50-minute thrill ride where visitors would be shown the location spots for many movies made at Silver Springs, as well as view native birds, gators, turtles, and of course the infamous rhesus macaque monkeys. Often thought to have been brought to Silver Springs for a Tarzan movie production, it was Colonel Toohey who is said to have released them on a man-made island in the river. Unfortunately, rhesus macaques are different from many primates and aren't afraid of swimming, so they soon had spread out all over the area. There's a great deal of rumors and stories about the rhesus, and goodness knows many of them aren't true. A process to capture some in the early 1980s collected around 200 on the Silver River alone, and it didn't make a dent in their overall population. Today they can be seen in the area, but since there are no longer tour boat operators to feed them, they are not as visible as they used to be. All that was Silver Springs before World War II. Not surprisingly, things didn't change again until after the war, when it became obvious to many attraction operators that Florida was entering a tourism boom, and if attractions wanted to get a good share of visitors' money, they needed to move from being quietly interesting to becoming showy and exciting, at least to people with the 1950s sensibility. Silver Springs made several changes itself, but it also doubled down on the concept begun with the arrival of Ross Allen, adding attractions that were part of Silver Springs' attraction, but were in fact separately owned. What happened over the course of just a few years would become a unique part of Florida's tourism history. Just a side note, this part of the video will include brochures for the other attractions under the Silver Springs umbrella. Notice that each one says, "at Florida's Silver Springs," clearly marking them as connected, yet separate entities. What's also clear is that Silver Springs didn't charge a general admission. Visitors got parking, the opportunity to check out the shops and the restaurant, and walk around the grounds free of charge. Admission tickets were only required for the 3 boat rides and entry to the separate attractions. In the 1950s, Silver Springs was operating its glass-bottom boats and a photo sup which premiered around 1950. A smaller boat that put visitors underwater so they could view the springs from the sides, not just downward. Also, Colonel Toohey was operating the jungle cruises out of the same docks, and Ross Allen had his reptile and wild animal shows and the Seminole Village. What was already a good-sized attraction increased significantly by 1956 with the addition of the Carriage Cavalcade, Tommy Bartlett's Deer Ranch, and the Prince of Peace Memorial. 3 separate attractions of very different natures, all connected with Silver Springs, yet separately owned. Tommy Bartlett's Deer Ranch opened in 1954. It had a ready-made audience, in that Bartlett was already a popular figure at the time. Originally titled Tommy Bartlett's International Deer Ranch, it was started by the Midwestern radio and television personality who was also a developer of a popular water ski show. It was known as the Tommy Bartlett Water Ski and Jumping Boat Thrill Show. Yeah, Tommy liked long titles. And it traveled around the country throughout the 50s. In 1953, the Chamber of Commerce of the Wisconsin Dells asked him to make the show a permanent feature in the area. This happened only 1 year before his Deer Ranch opened at Silver Springs. The deer ranch was exactly what its name implied. Brochures and postcards list a variety of deer that called the ranch home. These included whitetail and mule deer, plus elk from North America, muntjac, sika, diboski, which is a type of sika deer, and Barasinga deer from Asia, and European reindeer, as well as mountain sheep and Francis, the lovable Mexican burro. As one brochure stated, all the animals are bottle-fed and hand-raised with temperaments of gentle kittens. Visitors were welcome to pet and feed the deer. A 1956 deer ranch brochure proclaimed it was one of Florida's famous five, which also included the glass-bottom boat rides, jungle cruise, Ross Allen's Reptiles, and the Carriage Cavalcade. The Carriage Cavalcade was another completely different attraction built at Silver Springs. Opened around the same time as the deer ranch, its focus was carriages, wagons, coaches, as well as early automobiles and trucks. Sporting a reported 27,000 square feet or 2,500 square meters of indoor space, it contained one of the larger vehicle collections in the U.S. Its collection included horse-drawn carriages from the 18th century up to cars that at the time were only 20 years old but were already becoming vintage. The Carriage Cavalcade is not just a car museum, one brochure stated. It's a glorious cavalcade of bygone transportation. It went on to explain that while Dad and Junior are admiring the fabulous display of antique and classic cars, Mother and Big Sister will be impressed with the beautiful and authentic gowns worn by the mannequins in the many scenes. The museum is also listed as another of the fine new additions to America's outstanding vacation spot, Florida's famous Silver Springs. Carriage Cavalcade would be a popular part of the Silver Springs experience. It included outdoor displays arranged for photographers and provided period transportation for visitors to and from the main Silver Springs area. It would change its name to the Early American Museum around 1960 to reflect an expanded focus that moved beyond just carriages and cars. The Prince of Peace Memorial would be the last of the major additions in this era. Opened around 1956, the memorial presented the work of Paul Cunningham, a sculptor and artist who specialized in religious creations. As described in a brochure, the Prince of Peace Memorial was a series of beautifully hand-carved scenes from the life of Christ presented in the most interesting manner possible. Visitors would walk through a dramatic triangular entrance structure and into Cunningham's own studio. Past the studio, the memorial opened into a beautifully landscaped garden where individual chapels stood. These chapels contained Cunningham's work, highly detailed three-dimensional scenes from the life of Jesus. Featuring realistic figures of Jesus and the other participants in the story of his life, the sculptures were enhanced by interesting backgrounds placing the scene in first-century Judea. In all, there were 12 scenes, as can be seen in these postcards. Everything was portrayed in great detail, and it's considered to be the artist's life work. Cunningham was originally from Nebraska, and there was a similar memorial in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. All these separate attractions worked together through the 50s and on into the 60s. There are few reliable attendance figures available, but it's clear that Silver Springs is one of the most popular destinations in Florida. Located only a few miles from U.S. Highway 27, most vacationers who took that route south into Florida stopped for at least a day. In many cases, it was the first major stop in Florida. The 50s and 60s were the golden age of Florida tourism. Attractions such as Silver Springs, Cypress Gardens, Bok Tower Gardens, Parrot Jungle, and Weeki Wachee both defined the era as well as drove its success. Through their individual work, as well as through the Florida Attractions Association, they were some of the most significant developers of Florida tourism, both in physical and emotional terms. The Silver Springs attractions were featured in movies, newsreels, and on television. They were featured in magazines and newspapers. And it was no coincidence that much of the time Silver Springs was featured just happened to be during winter, the most popular time of the year for people to visit the state. When it came to Silver Springs, most visitors probably didn't realize that each attraction was a separately owned business, but it also didn't really matter. What we can see today is that Ross Allen, Tommy Bartlett, The Prince of Peace Memorial and Carriage Cavalcade each produced their own brochures that spoke directly to their offerings. On the other hand, the main Silver Springs brochures fulfilled three purposes: promote Silver Springs and its boat rides, promote the associated attractions, and provide a decent road map of Florida. These brochures were available by mail for the vacationer who was into pre-planning. They were also available at many locations throughout the state, such as the Florida Welcome Centers shown here, as well as restaurants and even other attractions. As for the 1970s and on towards the present, that will have to wait for another day. This video is long enough. Thanks once again for watching another of my videos. If it's the first one you've seen, welcome. Please check out my other videos. If you have enjoyed this one, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell. Stingray Tom's Florida, traveling through time around the Sunshine State.